All right, thank you for coming back and watching part 5. Part 1, 2, 3, and 4 are already done. We hope you've watched those and we've answered all your questions. Part 5 is basically going to talk about the Tech tab in the configuration menu. So, picking up where we left off on video 4, we're in the config menu where we make programming changes to the Classic. And we're going to click on the Tech tab and we're going to talk about what we're actually doing. So, a little bit confusing here is the MPPT mode. So if you remember back in video 3, I believe it was, in the basic tab here, we got to pick a MPPT mode for this controller. Solar, wind, hydro, etc. So once we pick that, in the tech tab, this field will change based on what we picked. If we picked hydro, we would get the proper fields to adjust for hydro. If we picked wind, we would get the ability to make a whole wind curve here. For the purpose of this video, we won't go into those differences because we anticipate most people are using it for solar, and that's what we will talk about here. If you've got any questions on wind, look for a video in the future entitled Setting Up Wind Curves or Setting Up Hydro. We'll do those two videos separately. So the only adjustment you have here is a sweep interval. And like we talked about in video 3, the solar tracking mode basically will do a full sweep of the array in 1/10 of a second, and it will do it anytime it sees a 10% or greater change in power or every 3 minutes. You can change that 3 minutes to less or more, but we find that seems to be a fairly stable number. If your power level changes 6%, it's only going to be 3 minutes before it resweeps the array, and at a 6 or 7% power change, you're not losing much to worry about. Versus setting it really low and having it sweeping a lot. This seems to be a good balance. But after you change that value, like all the other fields, you'd click on this little right button and commit that value to the Classic. The next one is ending amps, and for those that don't know, ending amps is basically a way to terminate the absorb charge prematurely. When I say prematurely, I don't mean the battery's not actually full. I mean prematurely of the timer. So typically, what you're doing is you're going to have a bulk charge which puts as much current as possible into the battery, and then you're going to, when you hit the absorbed voltage, you're going to go into a regulated state to maintain that voltage and slowly back the current down. That time is called the absorb time. Typically it's going to be 2, 3, 4 hours for a basic lead acid battery. One of the downsides to that is sometimes if it's been cloudy for several days, you might need a longer absorb time. And if you set it long and you get 5 or 6 sunny days in a row, you may do more absorbing than you need to do and use more water out of your battery. So to compensate for that, what you have is a function called ending amps, where the battery manufacturer will tell you at X many amps, we know the battery is full. So as that absorb cycle tapers down in current into the battery, at some point the battery is considered full because that's the amount of current that it takes. So let's say the battery manufacturer says that 1% of your capacity the battery is considered full. And remembering we have that 220 amp hour golf cart battery, 1% of that would be 2.2 amps. So we would set that here, and what will happen now is if we set it like this and we don't check this box, when the Classic itself drops to 2.2 amps in absorb, it will automatically switch to float no matter what the absorb time is left. Now that itself can be problematic because if there's an inverter in the system and there's loads running, we have no way of knowing what those loads are, and this number is really kind of falsified because that's the output current of the controller, not the actual current into the battery. So really, to do ending amps properly, we really need to add that Whiz-Bang Junior current sense module. And once we do that, then we select this box. And now what's going to happen when the Classic sees through the Whiz-Bang Junior that we're putting 2.2 amps or less into the battery for more than 60 seconds, it's going to now terminate the absorb charge and switch to float because it knows the battery is full. So this allows you to set a longer absorb time so that if you've had several bad days in a row, you get a proper charge still. But yet if you've had several good days in a row, you don't overcharge the battery on a regular basis, and it will terminate the absorb charge early based on the current acceptance of the battery. After you're all set, you click the button and save it to the Classic. Now, Rebulk is similar but different. So Rebulk is a voltage. It's set for 8 volts by default to defeat it because most people don't want Rebulk. Where Rebulk is really handy is in a wind turbine or a hydro application. What this basically does is if you set this to a voltage, say 52 volts, when the controller drops into float and the battery drops down because a large load came on, if it drops down to 52 volts, this is going to kick in and this is going to start a whole new absorb charge for the day. Again, it's really probably not going to be used on solar because if there's enough power to do another absorb charge, the battery wouldn't have dropped down to the low voltage to start. But if you've got a hydro that's continuous 24/7, but it's a little bit low on power, and then let's say you fire up the welder for 30 minutes to weld on the truck frame or whatever, your battery voltage drops pretty low for those 30 minutes. It could hit this trip point, and when you're done welding, then it's going to go through and do a whole new 3-stage charge to give the batteries, get them back where they need to be. Again, typically won't be used in a regular solar application, and you can see the manual for more information on that. Again, saving it after you're done. The next one is days between bulk. So it's been brought to our attention that not all battery manufacturers want you to do a full charge every day because that cycle is what wears the battery out. So if you very shallow cycle your batteries, say you maybe only use 5% or 10% of your battery capacity normally, you may want to actually skip some of those days and stay in float and not actually go to absorb. You want to check with your battery manufacturer and see what they recommend, if they recommend it. But if they do, this is where you'd set it. You could set this for, say, 14 days. And now what's going to happen is it's only going to do an bulk and absorb charge once every 2 weeks. And now you might want to play with the rebulk. So now you may want to set this because say you're on day 7 and it's been a kind of a cloudy, crappy couple days and the battery drops down to 47 volts. We now want on day 8 to try to do a full charge because the battery got so low. We don't want to wait for that 14th day. So these two would work in conjunction with each other and allow you to not do a full charge every day, but yet do a full charge every time it's needed. And that should extend the life of a typical battery, especially like an AGM or gel battery. Again, talk to your battery manufacturer or feel free to give us a shout and we can tell you the benefits of that. And when you're done setting that, again, the purple button. Excuse me. The next menu is the IP address networking stuff of the Classic, if you will. This is where you would set it to a static IP instead of DHCP. Basically what that means, it's going to be DHCP by default. And what that means for you that don't understand networking intricately is that the Classic is now, when it's plugged into your network at your house, it's now going to go out and ask your router, say, can you give me all the numbers and the values I need to properly work on your network? And the router is going to say, yes, here's the IP address, here's the subnet, here's the gateway, here's the DNS. It's going to give you all of those values right then and there. If you're into networking a little bit more, you're doing something like port forwarding, you're probably going to want to do a static IP address. One of the things you can do is you can leave it at DHCP, plug it in, then set it to static, and you'll get all these values, and then they will never change. Or if you've got a network where you've got things organized, you might set it to static right from the beginning and then just program these parameters as you normally would. But for most part, it's DHCP is going to be where this is going to be, and it should not need to be changed. The box beside this is for my MidNite web access, enabled or disabled. So if you want this controller to talk to my MidNite, you would enable web access here, and then you would save it. And now remember when I said earlier in video 3, anytime we make changes to the networking stack, we have to reboot the controller to make them take effect. So after we enabled my MidNite, then we'd go back over to the basic, actually the settings tab. I'm sorry, it is the basics tab. And we would do a reboot. And that would make those effects those changes take effect in the Classic. I'm not going to bother to explain what these values are up here, the primary DNS, the gateway. Those are all values that, like I say, DHCP takes care of those for you, so I'm not going to go into networking here. The one I will explain is this one right here. So the primary DNS, what DNS is, it's the domain name server. So to connect to, say, like my MidNite, what the Classic does is it goes out to a server out there, just like your computer does when you search for Fox News or MidNiteSolar.com, any of those URLs. What happens is your computer goes to that name server, asks it what's the IP address for this URL, where do I find it? The server tells it, and then it moves on and goes to that. So what this DNS override does is, if you get into a place where maybe the name server is not properly connecting you to my MidNite, tech support may ask you to put a value in here to override that name server lookup and point you at my MidNite directly. Normally this will be 0.0.0.0, and you should not change this. Only time you should change this box is if tech support has asked you to. Again, after everything's set, click this and then go back and reboot the controller. Modbus port 502 is default, and basically what that allows you to do is, say you've got 4 classics and you want to port forward, or you want to talk to them with a Modbus program of some form, and you don't want them all on the same port. This is fairly advanced stuff that most people won't adjust. But let's say you did have 4 controllers and you want to do port forwarding to all 4. Each controller is going to need a unique Modbus port so that you can port forward to that in your router. And this is where you would change that. You would change it from 502 to whatever number you want. You would save it, and then again reboot the controller to make that take effect. Battery voltage and input voltage offsets. So this is where you would calibrate the controller. If the controller is not matching your inverter, you could adjust it here to match. As you can see, this one's offset by 0.2 volts to make the battery voltage 52.3. And if you adjust that while you're watching your fluke, you want this number over here to match your fluke meter. And when you get where you want to be, you click the save button and it would write that value to the Classic, and now you've calibrated the battery voltage. And the same thing for the input voltage here. You can run this number up and down. You'd be watching this number here compared to your fluke multimeter, and when they both agree, you'd click this button and save it. So again, it's just a way to calibrate the Classic, and the manual actually calls that out pretty well on how to do that calibration, so I won't spend a lot more time there. Now we get into some of the features. Again, with ArcFault, like I say, once you enable ArcFault, or when you make any changes to ArcFault, you would scroll down here, you would save it, and then you have to reboot the controller for ArcFault to take effect. That's only written to the module on boot up. So any changes in the ArcFault stuff, you would reboot after you make the change. We can enable or disable ground fault. We can enable or disable Lomax. So I'm going to back up and explain what ground fault is. Ground fault is a protection device that is required by National Electrical Code in the United States. And what it's doing is it's looking for current leakage to ground, which could possibly shock somebody. And it's monitoring for that. And if it sees more than a half of an amp of current leakage, it will actually shut down the charging. The screen will turn red and it'll say ground fault error up here on the dash. So it's a safety feature that is required by NEC. Does come enabled. You can disable it if you want. If you're on a remote site, or if you're using like a wind turbine or a hydro turbine where you don't want to unload the turbine, you may choose to disable that and take the chance on that. Lomax enabled, checked is enabled, unchecked is disabled. Basically what Lomax is, it allows the input voltage to be drugged down to match the battery voltage. So if you've got a really hot summer day and the array voltage is a little low, we can drag that down really close to the battery voltage and still try to make some useful power out of it. The reason we can disable it is because typically when you are down at the input voltage, when you have the input voltage down at the battery voltage, the inductors make some noise. They sound like an old 56K modem, for those of you that are familiar with that. They make a little singing noise, like the variable pitch whining noise, if you will. It's not hurting anything, but some people are bothered by the sound, and we just give you the ability to turn that off if you don't need it. Night auto reset, just what it says. If this is checked, every night at midnight the controller will actually reboot. Excuse me. The reason for that would be, let's say you're flying up to a mountaintop in a helicopter and you're putting this in, and you're looking at $1,000 or $2,000 to get back up there if something gets haywire. With anything networking related, with the Ethernet, like my MidNite Local App, or basically anything like that, there can always be hiccups from here or there, especially in remote locations. And this basically gives you that last ditch effort to reboot the whole controller and try to remake that handshake before you have to go to the site and and reset stuff manually. So if you're on a really unattended site, it's a good idea to select this and leave it on, and every night at midnight it's going to reboot and try to correct any corruption in the networking or anything else that might have happened. Insomnia enabled. This is only for hydro. If you're doing solar or anything else, you want this unchecked. What this allows you to do, if you check this, it's going to try to stay awake all the time. And the reason for that is if you, let's say you got a Classic on a hydro turbine, and you got to go up and turn on the water to the hydro turbine. You don't want that relay to wait 18 seconds to turn on because the voltage may overshoot. So this is just a way to keep the relay engaged as much as humanly possible for like hydro turbines, but only for hydro turbines. So uncheck it if you're on solar or anything else. Keep logging at night. So remembering that the Classic itself has minutely logs in it that allow you to go look at some data points every 5 minutes. If you check this, it will log those data points through the night. If you uncheck it, it won't. So the reason you might not want this checked is because the Classic stores 380 of those points every 5 minutes. So if you uncheck it, it's only storing those points when the relay is engaged and it's actually charging. And that's going to give you more data points that are useful to you. But it's not going to show you like the lowest battery voltage that night or anything that happened in the middle of the night. So it's a decision you have to make. Do you want 24 hours of data points, or do you want 3 or 4 days of data points that are only there when the controller is actually charging? So if it's checked, it's going to log 24/7. If it's unchecked, it's only going to log when the relay is actually engaged and is charging. Reset net amp hours on 100% state of charge. So what this is doing is, with the Whizbang Junior, we get the state of charge meter, but we also keep track of net amp hours in and out of the battery. And as many of you may know with battery meters, because batteries are not 100% efficient, if you take out 10 amps, you might need to put 12 or 14 amps back in to fill that battery. So if you put, say, 16 amps back in, the battery stops getting full at 14. Those extra 2 amps were your float charge, if you will, and they don't really count. So then the next day when it starts going back down again, it's going to be 2 amp hours to the good already. So this allows that to actually zero that out every time the state of charge goes to 100 and keep it zero so that it'll always be fairly accurate. Some people don't like to have that on because they like to actually see how much the surplus was that didn't get used, or they've got a reason to track that. Typically by default that would be on, and that's where you would want it. And again, after you change any of those features, you would click this button to save it to the Classic. The last couple things we're going to get into, Follow Me. For those of you that don't know what Follow Me is, it's basically a network coordination of multiple Classics on a single battery. So if you had, say, 4 Classics on a single battery, you can connect them with phone cable in what we call Follow Me mode. And what that will do is they will all coordinate their charging so that they all go to float at the same time, or all go to equalize at the same time, or all share each other's ground fault errors, etc., etc. So if you had 3 or 4 controllers and you were going to wire them up in Follow Me, you would select Follow Me here, and you would save that. The other thing that you have to do is, well, you don't have to, but in Follow Me you have the ability to have just a single battery temperature sensor and share that across the network. Or you can have multiple sensors and not share them. It's your decision. If you have a single sensor and you want to share that across all of the Classics, you would check this box on any Classic that does not have a sensor, and then it's going to follow the master's sensor. So the one that had the sensor would not have this checked, and the ones that did not have the sensor would, and they would all ask that one that has the sensor, what is the battery temperature every time around. And of course after that you would save this, and that would solve the Follow Me. The next box is sort of related. This is the Modbus address of the actual Classic. So when you're looking at what this basically means in layman's terms is that the display on the Classic has to know what address it's looking for a Classic at. And the reason for that is because you could have a single display and have 4 classics and follow me, and you can use that single display to look at all 4 classics, 1, 2, 3, and 4. In order to do that, we have to know what those classics are. They can't all be address 10, or the display would see them all at the same time. So this is where we would give each classic a unique address, and then on the display itself, let's say we set this for 12. Then what we would do is on the display we would switch between address 10 and then we would go to address 12, and this classic would show up. So you would basically want to start at 10, and you'd want to go 11, 12, 13, 14, etc. and follow me, and then you could have a single display at the beginning on classic number 10, and you can go to address 11 and see what that classic's doing, address 11, 12, etc. And it just allows you to save some money on displays if you're using classic lights in a single classic. And after you've programmed that classic, you would click this button to save that, and that pretty much wraps that up. And that brings us to the bottom of the tech menu. Again, not too complicated, but a lot of names and words in there that may not make sense to people if they're not familiar with the controller. And that brings us to the bottom of the series as well. So like I said, do look for videos entitled Making a Wind Graph with the local app, or Setting up a Hydro Turbine with the local app. And appreciate your watching, and any questions, feel free to give us a shout. MidNiteSolar.com. We have an automated online ticket system. All of our emails are on the website. You can reach out to us anytime.